talk by Mike Priest. I had the pleasure of meeting Mike Priest yesterday. We had a long day together, and I had the opportunity to hear him speak up in Milwaukee, where they have a very nice round table. I encourage all of you, if you're up in that area, to stop in on Thursday nights, second Thursday of the month. They have a very nice affair there. Well, in looking at the newsletter, I note the reference by Ed Bars to Mike Priest being the Ernie Pyle of the Civil War, and I certainly can agree with that, having gone over his Antietam books at least. I'm not familiar with his other works, unfortunately, but I will be soon. Mike Priest gives us the soldier's eye view of the war, and he will, I'm sure, regale you with that. I never met Mike before yesterday, but I recall that when we were there at Antietam some years ago, seeing someone leading people across the fields of the Piper Farm there, I believe. We were over in the Sumter Road area of the field, and someone asked, who is that? And I said, oh, that's Mike Priest. He has a slouch hat on, and etc. And so I saw him from a distance and didn't meet him until yesterday. So for my own purposes, I think of him a bit as a Pied Piper as well. Although Ed Bars, of course, has been given that moniker as well. In any event, Mike will be speaking on South Mountain, and if I understand the talk correctly from yesterday's, a lot of the events leading up to the battle there. So, without further ado, Mike Priest. Thank you.
I have permission to make a couple of announcements, business type. There is a Civil War site I would recommend that you look up called civilwartour.org. When I went to Australia in March of last year to give a talk, I was the only fellow on board with a Civil War Preservation Trust hat, and this fellow dropped over and said, "Oh, you Yank?" "Yeah, well, yeah, I am." I'm going to be giving a tour, 9-day tour, in April of 2014 for educational world travel out of Australia. They're looking for Yanks to join in, okay, because they are slightly southern leaning. Can't understand why. And we're going to be doing first Manassas, Gettysburg, Antietam, Civil War Richmond, the plantations along the James, Civil War DC, and of course, being Aussies, they're going to look up a local winery and probably try to drain it in one day. I have never seen anyone who could absorb liquor like they can and still remember what they were drinking and still remain upright. Apparently they haven't changed since World War II. My father was there with the Marines. And the other thing is, on the 28th of September, I am conducting a walking tour of Antietam all day for anyone who wants to tag along and pay for it, because it's not free this time. It's with the Civil War Education Association. Their number is 800-298-1861. And we're going to go over parts of the ground that the average person doesn't get to. We're going to find all the groundhog holes. They're huge, but we're going to be going, cornfield, Westwood, Southern Attack Trail, and anyone who has the strength, we're going to go up to Tidball's artillery position down near the newcomer house. And that is some view. I finally got up there. But we're going to save that till last when everyone's too exhausted to go up the hill. But that's what's going to be going on, and I'd look forward, if any of you are in the area, to come by. I also have business cards in case anyone's looking for a tour. I can give you information on how to arrange it through the park, since I am a certified guide there. And I'm not allowed to advertise at the park, but I'm not there today. Okay. With that in mind, I'm going to start with the Maryland campaign. When I first did the research on the campaign, it's like everything else I do. I always tell the end of the story before the beginning. I did Antietam first. And it was supposed to be a small book, and 300 and some pages later, I sort of shocked my publisher. He'd never heard of South Mountain, and it turned out different. The story begins early in the war when Joe Johnston is in charge of the Confederate Army in the East. Jefferson Davis and he had devised a plan to carry the war north into Maryland. That isn't research I found. That's something I uncovered from someone who just put out a privately published book that thoroughly researched about the campaign. And Lee is going to act on that. There was just basically a blanket order that when the opportunity is right to move. Lee takes over the Army of Northern Virginia during the Peninsula Campaign when the best shot ever fired on the behalf of the Confederacy struck down Joe Johnston. Joe Johnston said that himself. Unlike McClellan, who only commanded an army twice, Joe is going to command 3 armies 3 different times. He just was like another Edward Ferrero, except that he was more competent. I'll be talking about him too. And what the Army discovers about Robert E. Lee is that when he loses battles, he attacks. They had not had that with Joe Johnston. I've always contended that if Johnston had not been removed, and if McClellan and he were still alive today, they'd still be staring at each other, looking for an opportunity to retreat. I'm not a big fan of McClellan's. Okay, I get a little facetious with him, but he deserves it. And Lee takes over. He doesn't win most of the battles during the 7 days. He loses, 28,000 men in a week? That had never happened under Uncle Joe. So the Army isn't too sure about the King of Spades, Granny Lee. All they know is that when he took over, they started dying. Well, following McClellan's first firing, he gets replaced by John Pope, who gets defeated at Second Manassas. And then at a night battle at Chantilly, Pope will get fired, will actually transferred out west to Minnesota, and McClellan will be back in charge to save the Union. When Lee gets to Leesburg, Virginia on September 4th, he has 55,000 men in various states of disarray and poor health. The Confederate Army was never going to be in the same situation it was in '62 until Appomattox. Their commissary system was non-existent. Ragged, dirty, evil-smelling. They look more like rabble than like Confederates. And an order goes out, once Lee decides to cross the river, that men who are sick and wounded and men without shoes do not have to cross the Potomac. Men in the 3rd Virginia Cavalry on vedette duty saw the infantry throwing their shoes into the Potomac River by far. One young fellow in the 28th Virginia wrote that he wasn't going to fight under the black flag, the red flag, or any flag. He wasn't going into Maryland. And it's because the focus of the war was changing from one of defense to one of aggression. The army that Lee crosses with will have about 40,000 men. 15,000, for whatever reason, went to Winchester or stayed in Virginia. When they crossed the Potomac into Maryland, Lee does so to draw the Union Army out of Virginia so it can harvest what crops are left. He hopes to win European recognition, which really was a bad idea because they were making money off of both sides by selling weapons. They had no need to really intervene. And if England had, it would have been to mediate the war. And his army intelligence, which was about as reliable as McClellan's, said that there were 35,000 loyal Marylanders eager to join the ranks. And they might have been on paper, but once they saw the rebel army, their enthusiasm waned considerably. They're going to cross into Maryland singing, "Maryland, my Maryland, the despot's heel is on thy shore." They must live in Maryland today. But once they cross, the Northerners come up with their own version of it. "O unwashed rags, to you we kneel. Hearken to our dire appeal. If you can't purchase soap, oh steal, that precious article I feel, like scratching from the head to heel. I cannot see thy blushing cheek, it hasn't been scrubbed for many a week. To get thee clean, the truth I speak, would dirty every stream and creek, from Potomac to Chesapeake. And the truth is it did. They polluted the Potomac River in crossing it. This one North Carolinian wrote home, I wished you was here to wash my clothes. I haven't done it since I left home. That was probably 6 months earlier. They were crusty. They could be smelled downwind from a mile or more away. Marylanders are going to hold their noses and hand their shoes to them. And this one Alabamian, a fellow named Smith, who said he had the appetite that would make a goat look dyspeptic, he and his friend raided a schoolhouse and cornered the master and the children in the front of the room. Well, they ate their lunches. They were desperate. Orders went out that anything that was taken had to be paid for in Confederate currency or in promissory notes that would be redeemed when the South won the war. That lasted until the first pig attacked a soldier. Ducks went wild and assaulted him. I mean, there wasn't a guy around that didn't have some kind of livestock that he killed in self-defense. This one lieutenant recalled, and they could tell he was a lieutenant, he had both sides of the seat of his pants were out, and he had no underwear. They used to brag that in Frederick there was usually more than one full moon out at any given night. But he said the colonel rode up and said, now you are not to destroy these fences. And he said that lasted until the colonel turned his back and the whole thing went to smack. Cornfields were stripped down to the ground. It was all raw corn too. They're going to ruin the Manassas River in 2 days. And a lot of it had to do with the chronic diarrhea that ran through the army, literally. It was not good. In Frederick, this one young lady, talking to her boyfriend who happened to be a Confederate cavalryman, said, John, how can such dirty, ragged, filthy men fight so well? And he said, well, Molly, we don't put on our best clothes to kill hogs. It's a bit of arrogance that's going to be lost at Antietam. You got to understand, this Confederate army is not an army. They're cavalry. When it crosses the river and fight their first action in a town called Poolesville, where the local citizens happen to be Confederate, they caught 100 men of the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry in a running fight in the town. The townspeople assisted the Confederates by blocking the streets with furniture, which the cavalry ran into. They not only got the men's horses, they got their boots, because a lot of them didn't have them. They got their weapons, including carbines, because they didn't have them, and sent the Yankees walking about 15 miles back to their own camp because they didn't want to mess with prisoners. The one thing that struck me about this campaign is that the Confederate cavalry in the early part of the campaign and the Union cavalry did a good job. Now, numbers. By the time the Confederate cavalry gets to Antietam, the entire division, 3 brigades, has 1,600 men in it. That's the division. They're being chased by a brigade of Yankees. No insult intended, please. I use them indiscriminately. I mean, I didn't know damn Yankee was 2 words till I went to college. And I thought y'all had it wrong on who won the war. But anyway, that's going to consist of the 3rd Indiana, the 8th Illinois, and at one time or another the 5th New York. They're going to have 1,500 men in a brigade. Between September 5th and September 15th, 20 cavalry actions get fought. 20. And for the most part, the Rebs get a beating in it. They lose. Of the 20 skirmishes, the Federal cavalry will lose 149 men and the Confederates 162. As early as this time in the war, the Northern cavalry had an advantage. For one thing, they have carbines. They have boots. And they also had numbers, lots of numbers. I mean, seriously, the Confederate cavalry was not at its high point at this time. As the Confederates moved through Maryland, they stripped the fields clean. They leave an impression that anyone who wants to go in the Confederate Army is free to do so as long as they want to commit suicide. Lee will liberate Maryland in an announcement on September 9th and recruit 500 men, all of them from Baltimore. He's losing over 500 a day to desertion, exhaustion, diarrhea, and just out and out French leave. They're taken off. His intelligence made a mistake. Now, he is being pursued by George McClellan. McClellan's right where he needs to be. He's in charge. Most generals had egos. McClellan's was a lot taller than he was. He reminds me of an academic student I had one time who came in and said, "Give me my A now because I know more than you do." He worked for that A. When he was done, he says, "Man, you really have learned a lot in the last few weeks." But anyway, McClellan is going to come back to save the Union, and the men were glad to see him. They really liked McClellan. He took care of them. They were his children, though he treated them in a very condescending manner. They were still his children. And it was his army. And in a way, it was. McClellan is going to accomplish in 10 days what no one else probably could have done. He is going to put an army together on the road. One of the finest armies that ever marched. The Army of the Potomac. Really, if it hadn't been for them, Gettysburg would have been a bad situation. They were a good army. Not good leadership all the time, but a good army. He's going to take the Kanawha Division, 9th Corps, out of North Carolina. He's going to take Pope's Army of Virginia. He's going to pull in the 12th Corps and other new units and put together an army of 87,000 men. Now, unfortunately, 27 of the regiments, at least, are brand new. By the time they get to Antietam, some will have 35 days in the service. Many of them will never have fired their weapons until they get to Antietam. It's called on-the-job training. Getting a new teacher and throwing them in a room filled with special ed students, and the instructions are, keep the door shut. That's what these men are learning on the road. They're going to turn out to be some very good regiments. But this is not the way to learn. Lee is constantly putting out his cavalry. He's going to have Stuart raid north of the Baltimore Pike, and McClellan's going to have to spread out his forces from what is now 355, the Georgetown Pike, all the way in a wide arch around the Baltimore Pike to basically screen from cavalry because he doesn't know if he's going to attack Baltimore or not. Now, McClellan, too, has good intelligence, and it serves his favor. Halleck said there were 100,000 Confederates in Maryland. Pinkerton, his chief scout, who did his work from behind his own lines, is going to reinforce that. And McClellan's going to want to believe it. Now, being a Marylander, we probably would have been better off if there had been 100,000 Confederates, because we would be owned by somebody else. Maryland, if there had been 100,000 Confederates, Antietam would have been a different story. But it's always better to be outnumbered, and McClellan always was. Because I think he was so afraid that he might lose that he didn't try to succeed. Now, can I base that on studying biography? No. That's my own biased opinion. What will happen is that McClellan will get to Frederick on the day that Lee decides to leave. Now, here's where some things get a little bit confusing. Lee is going to, of course, write Special Order 191. And I don't put a whole lot of stock in it. I just don't. Ezra Carman, the historian for the Monument Commission, Colonel of the 13th New Jersey, is going to write that McClellan actually said that he thought that the lost orders were lost in a 27-acre field on purpose so he would find them. Okay. My contention, and again, it's just personal facetiousness on my part, is that the reason the lost orders were lost is because McClellan had them. He didn't act on them. His concept of all due haste was 18 hours. Now, go back to Frederick. Lee realizes that he can't liberate Maryland because Maryland doesn't want to be liberated. He hit the wrong part of the state. Southern Maryland, Eastern Shore, he might have gotten 10,000 men. They weren't exactly eager to go to war either. Because Maryland had it good. They were protected by the federal government and they could still keep their slaves. You know, I mean, and Western Maryland, they were brethren, pacifists. You know, even Jackson wrote about the Mennonites in the valley. They made great soldiers. They do whatever you say, but they won't kill anybody. Well, the brethren were the same way. So, you know, he's writing out through hostile territory. I contend that Lee actually was retreating when he leaves Frederick. I found evidence that he put out ordered Jackson to put out the rumor that he was going to go north and attack Harrisburg. You need an army to do that. Lee didn't have one. He knew he was outnumbered. Plus, if they'd have gone up on the eastern side of South Mountain, they wouldn't have gotten to Harrisburg by a direct route. They'd have to go through Gettysburg and all that. So, you know, it just didn't make sense to me. The reason he splits his army, and this is just based on what he did, because Lee was very careful about not telling people what he was thinking. He splits his army outside of Frederick so that the garrison at Harpers Ferry, which is behind him with 13,000 men, won't be able to interfere with him getting across the Potomac. It's an encirclement. Martinsburg, by way of Hagerstown, Walker was already in Loudon Valley area, Loudon Heights, and McClaws down through the gap into Maryland Heights. He had to remove him. Also, that was the entrance to the Shenandoah Valley, right through Winchester. And even though they weren't good troops, because they weren't properly led, and they were holding an indefensible position, they still could be a threat. So I really believe he was retreating. He starts out, and on the 10th, his men are already heading to Middletown and going around on the flank with the idea of using some of Longstreet's command to defend the gaps. He only knew that 2 were there. Stewart knew about Fox's Gap, but neglected to tell Lee about it. Lee didn't know that it was there. Garland, who goes to defend the gap, didn't know it was there until the morning of the fight, when he heard artillery on his flank and didn't realize that it was Pelham of the horse artillery. No one told him. He thought he'd been flanked already. So, you know, it's a real snafu. When the Union Army goes into Frederick, it's one of those grand moments. They have the Monocacy River separating them from Frederick, the 9th Corps from Frederick. They've got one bridge going over it, the old stone bridge. The Confederate Engineer Corps, which had no tools, made it rather unique, tried blowing it up by setting powder kegs on the bridge and lighting them off. It charred the bridge, but it didn't do anything. The 8th Illinois Cavalry, well, not the 8th Illinois, excuse me, the Chicago Dragoons, I think it was, and the 1st West Virginia Cavalry, Company A, led by a Colonel Moore of Ohio, who was an infantry officer, made a gallant charge across the bridge, along with Simmons' Kentucky Battery. They're going to charge down Patrick Street, right through the heart of Frederick. Just as you get to this one alley, the 1st North Carolina, all 100 of them, ambush them. Colonel Moore gets unhorsed. How? The guy grabbed him by the collar and pulled him and the horse down to the ground. The Illinois cavalry turn around and run back down Patrick Street. On the way, they happen to bump into the artillery section in the square and knock down the number 4 men with the lanyards, who happened to fire through the Illinois cavalry. canister going down Patrick Street. Their casualties were self-inflicted. The Confederates will escape and take Colonel Moore with them, and they will parole him just this side of, well, the east side of South Mountain. Of course, when you're paroled, you can't give away information. He will blurt some and then shut up real quick. The Ninth Corps will then march into Frederick and occupy it. Frederick is one of those beautiful towns where it flew whatever flag went through. And this one impetuous young lady, and by the way, they were all young women, no matter what. These guys were male chauvinist pigs, from the word go. They were not politically correct. This young lady stepped out on the pavement, looked at the soldiers, 23rd Ohio, and said, "I could kiss every one of you." And this grizzled old sergeant stepped up and volunteered, and she took off like a shot. Lieutenant Wilson of the 12th Ohio wasn't so fortunate. He said that he got snatched up off his feet by a rather large German woman who, as she was dancing around with him, nearly crushed him in her arms. And another fellow in the 23rd had a rude encounter with a peach tree. He decided to climb it to get a peach and fell off onto his own bayonet. He was the infantry casualty for the day. Now, McClellan's going to march in victorious. And while he's there, the 27th Indiana has a picket detail out. One of the men is Corporal Barton Mitchell, Company F, who probably couldn't read. He picks up an envelope. Cigar falls out. He grabbed it. Why? He wanted to smoke. He could see there was writing on it. He handed it to his sergeant. His sergeant read it. Saw D.H. Hill on it. This might be important. Took it to his captain, Peter Kopp, who will get killed in the cornfield in Antietam. And Kopp turned it over to the brigade commander, Gordon, who then turned it over to Adjutant General, who recognized the handwriting as that of R.H. Chilton, who had been quartermaster with the Army in Detroit and had turned over plenty of checks to this young officer who had been a bank teller. It ends up going to Alpheus Williams and then ends up going to McClellan. Now, there's a story about a civilian here in McClellan. You say something like, "Got me where I want him," and a civilian riding over the mountain and telling Stuart, and then Stuart riding into Boonesboro and telling Lee. Either way, it was kind of irrelevant. McClellan's going to devise this huge envelopment of the mountain gaps with the 1st Corps, the 9th Corps, and the 6th Corps, and have no knowledge of the terrain. One of those brilliant moves. And he doesn't really act on it. When the battles start going on at the gaps, McClellan's not even on the field. He got caught in a traffic jam with the 1st Corps on Route 40, the National Pike. He'll get there about 2 o'clock and never go anywhere near any of the gaps. He's going to supervise from a hill, which is still there, and the marker to him is still there. It's on private property. And there's a flag flying up there now. So he's going to kind of like be a predecessor of the World War I generals who commanded best from the farthest distance behind the lines. While all this is going on, okay, Lee leaves a rear guard at the gaps. They're not large forces. And for instance, at Fox's Gap, where the fighting starts at 9 o'clock on the 14th and ends at 9 o'clock at night, he'll only have at the most, at the gap at any one time, 945 to 1,100 men. That's it. Now, if you count all the troops who marched onto the field and marched away from it, took the wrong road, at Fox's Gap, he'll have about 6,700 men. He's only facing the entire 9th Corps of 13,400 and some. The shooting starts at 9 o'clock, just as Garland is coming up to what they call the South Mountain House, when Pelham, who's left there by Stuart, opens fire on the 9th Corps, causes them to spread out along both sides of the road, and Garland then runs his men along the Appalachian Trail to get there because he thinks he's been flanked by Union artillery, and it's not. By the time he gets to the gap, Pelham is a mile behind him on a hill, defending nothing. And it starts like that. It's kind of like Thermopylae. In the all-day fighting, the Confederates will lose 899 men, and the Federals 889. What's important, though, is they'll lose 2 generals. General Garland is shot in a skirmish in Wise's Field by the 30th Ohio. He got too close to the 13th North Carolina. He's wounded seriously. His staff will evacuate him to Turner's Gap and not tell his second in command that he's been hit. The second in command, McCrae, will find out when the Yankees attack with a bayonet charge at noon, and he can't find Garland. Garland will bleed to death at the Mountain House. He'll be put in an ammunition wagon, hauled down into Boonesboro. They're going to go on the way around Hagerstown, and they're going to get captured by the Union cavalry breaking out of Harpers Ferry, led by an Alabamian named Davis, who had a great accent. And they're going to end up in Chambersburg with General Garland. The report that the Federals wrote is that we captured a Confederate ammunition train and a Confederate general. They just neglected to mention the fact that he was about 2 days old and very dead. Okay, Garland will end up in Lexington and get buried there. Not in very good shape. The other one that gets killed there, of course, is Jesse Reno. There's a lot of controversy about that. One of the brigades that gets put on the field at dusk is under Edward Ferrero, colonel, part-time dancing instructor from West Point, whom the men hate. In all his wisdom, he's going to grab the brand new 35th Massachusetts. Now, they had only fired the weapons once down at Frederick. They had muskets. The ammunition was ill-fitting because a lot of it, after the smoke cleared, rolled out the barrel and fell into the Monocacy. He sends them over the mountain in the dark to find the Confederates. If you've ever been on South Mountain with all that, what Ohioans call rhododendron, you can get lost in broad daylight. Well, they're out in the woods. They're coming back. He's trying to organize his men. He's not quite on the field. Reno rides in the Old Man Wise's field. And part of the Massachusetts boy are forming in the dark over to the north side. But the general's on horse, looking through his binoculars in the dim light at rebels coming over a fence catty-cornered to him, about 300 yards away, picking up weapons. While he's doing that, a fellow bumps into his horse and yells, "Rebel cavalry!" At which point the order yells, "No!" Too late. Guy fires, bullet goes through Reno's left hand, hits his sword scabbard, and goes up into his chest. At that moment, the Rebs open fire. Well, the 35th Massachusetts, which is behind the 51st Pennsylvania, opens fire too. They missed the Confederates, they hit the 51st Pennsylvania, who turns around and returns fire. At which point in the dark, Hood's Texans open fire from 10 feet away in the woods over the Pennsylvanians, aimed too high, and hit the Massachusetts band, including their lieutenant colonel. It's not a good day. As Reno is hauled off on a blanket, Captain Gabriel of the 17th Michigan is right there helping, and Orlando Wilcox rides up. And he says, "Wilcox, I've been shot by my own men." Now, his biographer said that, of course, he was mistaken. So was the eyewitness, apparently Captain Gabriel. And of course, so was Wilcox. He wrote it in his diary. He gets hauled to the base of the mountain, leaned up against the stump where he'll die, and his orderlies are told, "Don't say anything about this." You can't have a hero die in a friendly fire. So they didn't for 20 years. Then in the National Tribune, this one orderly wrote about it, identified him as a friend, and, well, he was shot by rebels. We don't know where he was hit. Well, Captain, his surgeon's report that I found later described the wound, which is interesting. But on the day of the battle for Burnside Bridge, I got into 6th New Hampshire, is sitting down writing the letter home. His name was Batchelder. Maryland farms are sloppy. Butter's expensive. Bread's expensive. The fence rows are overgrown. General Reno got shot by a Massachusetts man the other day. Maryland sure doesn't know how to farm. He just keeps on going. Now, it's like anything. You don't want to accuse anybody with the truth, and heaven help you if you have evidence. It's obviously true that when Reno was dying, he misspoke when he told Wilcox he was shot by his own men. He wouldn't have any idea if he was or not, unless it's point blank. By the way, the 35th Massachusetts was the only regiment not allowed to attack the bridge. Something had to do with the fact they couldn't be trusted. Now, late in the afternoon, you're going to get Turner's Gap going in Crampton's Gap. Crampton's Gap is 6 miles south of Fox's Gap. The 6th Corps is going to arrive there at noon and stop for orders. And to put, the 96th Pennsylvania robbed every house in town. I mean, the rebels didn't even have a chance. At the base of the mountain is a large brigade under Parham of 360 men. 1 man every 6 feet. McClellan's going to arrive at the base of Turner's Gap, order a grand assault at 4:30. It was a timed assault. No one ever pulled that off. Of course, he didn't know what the ground was like. That didn't matter. At 4:30, 2 divisions of the 6th Corps are going to attack that gap. The biggest problem was getting up the mountainside, not overrunning the Rebs at the base. And when it's over at dusk, an hour and a half later, the Confederates, who committed 4,500 men to the action, have lost 1,051 of them, 23%. Of the 8,700 Federals engaged, 427, 5%. Lee is in bad shape. Well, excuse me, that was Turner's Gap. I got him backwards again. It's okay. We'll just switch names. I'm no good with notes, okay? So let's get this right. Crampton's Gap, 4,700 reps, 20% loss, 958. 13,000 Federals, not bad odds. 558, 4%. Turner's Gap, which is a mile north of where the gap actually is, on ground that makes a 45-degree ravine looks flat. It's awful ground. They're going to lose in an hour and a half, 23%, and the Federals 5. It's not a walkover. Both gaps are steep. The biggest obstacle is getting to the top of it. Accounts of men grabbing tree roots, trying to pull themselves up the side. And at least at Crampton's Gap and Fox's Gap, 2 bayonet fights, actual bayonet fights. At Fox's Gap, there's a sergeant named Leonidas Incho, 12th Ohio. He's got one of those moments that only happens in Hollywood. He gets up to the stone wall at the top of the mountain, looks over, and he's looking down a Colt aimed right at his forehead. He reached over the wall, grabbed the revolver, and put his finger between the hammer and the cylinder, pulled the captain holding it over the wall and beat the garbage out of him. 6 Rebs come to rescue him. He took the revolver and shot 5 of them and got the other one to surrender. Medal of Honor recipient. I think that's hilarious. I can just see that now. It's almost like a cartoon.
I'm glad he was on our side.
At Crampton's Gap, this Private Smith in the 6th Alabama, oh, that's great with Crampton. An entire brigade of the Pennsylvania Reserve attacks the Confederate left, the 6th Alabama under John Brown Gordon. They're in a farm lane at a cabin known as the Widow Mains. There were an awful lot of widows back then. Every widow in the area, every woman in the area was a widow. But she had a stone cabin with an indoor well. And Gordon is riding back in front, inspiring his men as the Yankees, who are 4 times their number, come at him. And the widow is standing there with her children around her. They describe her as a white-haired woman with 6 tow-headed children. And she's going, "You Rebs ain't getting in here. You're not getting my well. No way. No, I'm not helping you with nothing." And Gordon's trying to reassure her, and they're yelling, "Go to it, Granny. You tell him." And Gordon just shut up. They're going to get driven off after one attack, but they're only outnumbered, 6 to 1, 7 to 1. And they're going to end up in a ravine and end up at the top of another one and retreat at dark. It's just an off-sided battle. And what happens that's so important, it's the first time that Lee lost and had to retreat. He'd never had to do that before. Union soldiers who fought in the battle when the temperature was 76 and drops to 30 at night, said that for the first time they didn't mind the cold because their blankets were at the bottom of the mountain, because they actually held ground that they won. It's a first for McClellan. It'll actually be a last, too. Okay? You can't have too many firsts with McClellan. Why is that important? Lee is going to decide to fight at Antietam, as he writes Mrs. Jackson after the war, because he could not go back into Virginia whipped. He's going to lose 38% of his men. He had under 30,000 at Antietam. They're pretty sure of that now. McClellan will put in 53,000 and lose 24%. He'll win because Lee has to retreat. But Lee, according to Ezra Carman, won the tactical battle. Lee will cross into Virginia, and something happens that we can't even fathom. Because he held this Union army at bay, he becomes the Lee that everyone will follow. By Fredericksburg in December, he has 75,000 men. By April of 63, he's got 85,000. This is where the legend builds from. He's no longer Granny Lee, he's Mark Roberts. The battle is weird, but the battle transforms that. He brings back the men who refused to cross. The men who were at Antietam and walk away, which weren't many, become the core of the army and the legend that Lee is going to build around it. McClellan, on the other hand, he'll get the strategic battle. He'll actually get on the battlefield of Antietam around 2 o'clock in the afternoon when there's no shooting in the area. His army will occupy the ground on the 19th once they're convinced that the Confederates have actually left, and Lincoln gets the political victory. But the battle, the Maryland campaign, is what brings McClellan down. His veterans after this, many of them, felt that they lost so many men for nothing. When the Union Army crosses into Pennsylvania in June of 63, a story comes down that McClellan's back in charge, coming down with, an emergency army, and the cheering broke out in his pets, the 5th Corps, for about 2 seconds. That was it. They were done with him. When he runs for president in 64, he's going to get beaten royally, even in Andersonville. They held an election in Andersonville, and he lost 60-40. Now, the vote might have been rigged a little because Andersonville wasn't a good place, but still, they were done with him. Antietam does that. It's pivotal. And I'm not saying it because I'm biased about Antietam, but this is just based on things that I've observed. More evidence might come out that would disprove it, and that's great, because that's what history is. The main thing I gathered out of the Maryland campaign is that I really believe that Lee knew he wasn't going to win Maryland by the time he gets to Frederick. I really believe that the reason he split his army was to take out that garrison behind him, because he was crossing to the west side of the mountain to put it between him and the Union Army, and the route he's following through Hagerstown is going across the river, not north. It's not moving north. It's hard to supply an army in an area where you're not wanted. And I think that's my belief. I don't study generals much because I can no more figure them out, and no insult intended. Of course, maybe that's why I said that. The same way I can figure out an administrator. Okay, I was a frontline teacher. I never could figure out what the boss was thinking. After a while, I just gave up. Well, it's the same with generals. Generals only tell you what they want you to know. And that's one of the things that made Lee great. He kept his own counsel. Of course, McClellan kept his own counsel because he was his own best advocate. He never lost an argument with himself. And again, I'm being stupid about it, but that's how I feel about McClellan, too. So, the Maryland campaign did change the course of the war. After Maryland, Lee is going to have victory after victory, and he's going to start believing his own invincibility. And the thing is, I just finished turning the book into Sabbath on the second day at Gettysburg on Cemetery Ridge. It's ironic. The odds on the second day between the 3rd, 5th, and 2nd Corps were the same as they were at Antietam. And the percentage of losses were the same, 24 to 36%. It's funny how history repeats itself. And, you know, it's like the same mistake keeps getting committed. I think what Lee was best at was a good defensive war. If he picked the ground, you were in trouble. If he was there first. And that shows up in the wilderness. But I don't think they ever were going to, I don't think they much stood a chance with it. And it's not lost cause with the numbers and all. Now, I just want to finish with one story. And it's because it's bad. James Steptoe Johnston was an aide with the 11th Mississippi to McIver Law. Fantastic brigade. He wrote a 7,000-word letter to his girlfriend after the battle. I admire a man that can do that. The first half is telling her about all the women in Maryland. He tells her about a Miss Dorsey, not Horsey, in Frederick, on whose porch he spent the evening. He told her that the girls in Frederick, being Southern, are extremely attractive. Up toward Hagerstown, being German, they're exceedingly clean, but also exceedingly ugly. And then he spent the other half of the letter telling her how much he loved her. I mean, if I were him, I would rethink that whole thing before even going home. My experience with 44 years of marriage is that women have a memory that gets better as the years go on. Okay? You know, they'll come up with, well, why do you say that? What? And they'll remember the whole conversation that you forgot 3 seconds after you said it. This guy's got it in writing. Okay? Just part of it. Now, what I'd like to do is take questions, because that's, I think, the benefit of giving a talk is, if I don't know, I'll tell you. If I think I can snow you, I'll try. But I prefer questions, because that's where the best parts of the talk occur. Seriously. Okay.
I have a comment and a question.
Uh-oh.
Well, the comment being, many people in this room, I think, would question that Lee won a tactical victory at Antietam, and it's based on the fact, and I think part of you didn't specifically say that he remained on the field the next day on the 18th and awaited an attack, and nobody came.
Right.
But in part of what you were getting at about Lee's invincibility, on the night of the 17th, Lee called a council of his generals, and everybody from Stonewall Jackson to Hood said, we got to get out of here. And as the commander has the right to do, he voted to stay. Mm-hmm. And the one had it. Yeah. He stayed. McClellan didn't attack. He gets a tactical victory, and Lee brought it all about himself.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in that sense, and that was the tactical victory, in that he stayed there and McClellan wouldn't come at him. Mm-hmm. But then I go on my question. I'm reviewing this manuscript about Antietam, of all things. What can you tell me about the legality of Lee crossing the Potomac River into United States territory? Because this had come up before, and you alluded to Joe Johnston and ideas earlier in the war, previously earlier in your talk as well. But there was there's a like the soldiers who wanted to bow out going north from Lee's army. There was some law about Lee that Davis had authorized this, or you know.
That was the understanding I got from the recent research I've seen. I think that's going to be under debate for a while. That isn't my conclusion. That's something I just found out about. Because the fellow that wrote that was arguing that Lee, being the professional soldier he was, would not have crossed the river on his own authority. And then he came up with this background information. That's not from my research. As far as being the tactical victor, that came from Ezra Carman. who was on the Monument Commission, colonel of the 13th New Jersey. That's based on what he said. If it had been me and I lost 38%, I don't know that I would have wanted to have gone home, because that was devastating. I mean, but it's part of Lee's nature. The story about the evening, you're quite right about staying. The story I have heard, and again it might be just a story, is that as he was talking with his generals, he noticed that General Hood was in the shadows. And he said, General Hood, where's your fine division? He said, dead on the field where you sent them. That's one story.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I don't know that Lee really realized how badly he was hurt. He was on the field all day at Antietam, putting men in the field like a brigade and division officer. But when you look at it, he probably had the size of a Union Corps by the time it was all over. He was thinking of staying. He really was.
No, he stayed.
Yeah, the 18th he did.
Yeah, nobody else. Oh, he was. Yeah, that's right. Nobody else wanted to stay.
Right. But the thing is, I think it finally dawned on him too that his army had really been crippled. I mean, I don't know that he was fully aware of it. I can't judge that because I don't have the evidence. But your observation that he decided to stay is true. But he realized too that there's more Union troops on the way. And his artillery had been battered. His ammunition train, Longstreets, had been captured. He was in dire shape. But he retreated on his turn. He retreated on his turn. And that's typically Lee. All right, I hope that answered it. But I really don't feel confident outside. Any other good questions? Yes, sir.
How is the vegetation different or similar now from what it was in
Okay, how is the vegetation on South Mountain or at Antietam?
South Mountain.
At South Mountain, one entire gap, a mile north of Turner's, is still in private hands. Some of the original farms are there, the original houses are there, and the original road. That is a terrible road. As far as the vegetation, it's got a lot more trees on it than it did then. Crampton's Gap, you could see all the way to the base of the mountain because the woods was getting thinned out for firewood. And the Germans had terraces cut in the hills, they're still there. At Fox's Gap, it's all overgrown where they had Hadwise's field. Until about 1962, most of the field was there. But it's all overgrown now. And the original road that ran by the cabin is still there, but it's not the paved road. That's post-war. When you go to interpret, you have, I'm not good with GPS. I never learned to use it yet because I don't have it. You can take the old maps and you can pretty well approximate where you are. Where the North Carolina monument is there, that was a cornfield. The original wall is there. The big 6-foot wall, part of it is still there. All the walls on this side, on the east side of the mountain, west side of the mountain, got torn down. They were used for paving. And it's all overgrown. But it can still be interpreted. It's just that you got to get an idea of where you are. Any other good questions? Yes, sir?
Could you comment a little bit about Jeb Stuart's absence?
Okay. I'm going to get in trouble. First survey. Anyone a Stuart fan? Okay. 'Cause I don't want to get shot after the meeting. Stuart was on the way to Harpers Ferry. He never reported to D.H. Hill that there was a gap, Fox's Gap, a mile south of Turner's Gap. He was on the way to Harpers Ferry because he wanted to be there when it got captured. That's why on the 13th, down at Crampton's Gap, 3 Union cavalry regiments, one of them the 3rd Illinois, 8th Illinois, and the 3rd Indiana, on a recon are going to walk into the back of Cobb's Legion and get in a saber and carbine fight in a ravine that takes out 29 men. Stuart just kept on going. He wanted to get there for the surrender. He posted Pelham with the 5th Virginia Cavalry, all 50 of them, at Fox's Gap. They're the ones that fire on the 9th Corps and then light out. And the infantry's coming up to get the Yankees on their flank when it wasn't Yankees, it was their own. So he did not do his job right, in my opinion. but that's not hard to get my opinion. Neither side, by the way, at Antietam used their cavalry right. Neither one. The ground's not suited for good cavalry charges anyway. But neither one of them used it right. And Stewart at Antietam was playing infantry officer again like he did at Drainsville. He's out supervising artillery fire from Nicodemus Ridge rather than staying with his cavalry in the wide arc, very wide arc down the Potomac. It's just the way it is. I mean, that's what the men said. Other good questions? Yes, sir.
I have a bad question. Larry, he's direct supply line. Did he have enough food, fodder, and ammunition
Okay.
to stay there a couple of days and fight another day's battle?
Did he have enough food, fodder, ammunition to fight another battle? He never had enough food when he went into Maryland. They were starving. The Confederates were starving. And as far as ammunition and animals, no. He couldn't have lasted more than another day. He didn't have the supplies. His artillery was badly battered. The ones that were on the field itself, not at Nicodemus Ridge, were badly torn up. Union artillery had them outgunned. There's going to be 530 guns engaged in that 12-hour fight. And the Federals never had to worry about running out of ammunition. McClellan was good at logistics. I mean, seriously. But Lee didn't have it. With that whole command ammunition train gone, he couldn't have had it. And the horses never had enough. Not in this campaign. So he could have held up like he did on the 18th, but on the 19th, if he'd have stayed, he probably would not have crossed the river. He was under artillery fire all day himself, too, with the National Cemetery. He was under fire all day. And it's just lucky that he wasn't hit. But no, he didn't have the material. Other questions? Yes, sir?
What difference do you think it might have made if Franklin had proceeded in a more expeditious manner?
Oh my.
Yeah.
I'm one of these people that's not very good with what-if questions. The fact that Franklin really was a McClellanite sort of negates the fact that he would act quickly on anything. The biggest problem is that when they take Crampton's Gap at dusk, the woods are so thick, they have no idea where they're going. And the next day, when he did go over the mountain, just as they get in the valley, they hear this shouting rolling up from Harpers Ferry along the pike. And a Yankee jumps up behind the wall and says, "What's all that about?" Reb jumps up, "Harpers Ferry is going up the spout, damn you." And at that, okay. They didn't know what was down that valley, and they didn't want to go look. And, McClellan never encouraged his officers to take initiative. The Confederate Army, out of necessity, had to. The theory was, it's easier to ask permission, easier to be forgiven than to ask permission. And if you fail, no one's going to know because you're going to be dead. I mean, seriously, the Confederates always took initiative because of their training. McClellan's army takes everything from the top down, and he did not encourage initiative. You're not going to find that until Gettysburg. That's where you really see Federal soldiers taking on initiative, particularly in the wheat field. You're not going to find it before that, though. It was just never going to happen. Okay, one more thing?
Take another question if there is. If not, I have a question. This is one of those, what did he know and when did he know it? If Lee, as you say, was retreating, he retreated west from Frederick through Turner's to the west side of South Mountain, but he did not leave behind anybody to guard the gaps initially until he learned. Is that correct? That he learned that McClellan was.
He did have a rear guard. At Crampton's, you're going to have Parham's Brigade because that's where the wagon train rolled through out of Middletown. At Turner's, on the eastern face, you're going to have Colquitt's Brigade because it was the largest brigade in the Army of Northern Virginia, all 1,400 men. And at Turner's Gap, Hill was up there. And he said on the night of the 13th, when he looked out across the valley and saw all the campfires light up like fireflies, he said he felt like the loneliest man on earth. And he's going to send orders down to Boonesboro to bring garland up. Yeah, so he did have a rear guard.
So that at that point, then, Lee already knew that McClellan was after.
Yes, there's some good indication of that. Yeah, well, when the men are coming over the gaps, Confederates on South Mountain could see the bayonets glistening at the roads coming over from Frederick. And it's like, yep, they're out there, and Lee knew. He knew. Someone told him. I mean, he had good communication, except with Stuart. He knew.
So then that would, do you believe that supports your idea that Lee was retreating? Because if he were advancing, he perhaps would not have left people to guard his rear at that
He
point?
probably would have someone to guard the gap, but you split your army and send them around to the south if you're intending on going north.
Well, that's the whole 191
Yeah.
complex. Very good.
Yeah, but he did use the mountains in 63 on his right flank to shield his advance while Stuart was going around stealing horses and all. And doing a good recon, which he never told anyone about.
Does that prompt any question on the part of anyone else? Okay. One.
I had one question on Lee, on South Mountain. Where was he at in the morning and the afternoon?
Okay, Lee is going to show up on what's now Dahlgren Road, on the top of the hill, just as it goes past this huge open field where a Confederate battery was. He'll be there late in the afternoon. He will be under fire from the First Corps, but he'll show up in an open field, now overgrown, behind what's left of Kemper's huge brigade of 136 men. He will be there. And he will be seen in the National Pike as the men retreat. He couldn't be at all three gaps. The distance was just too great.
I think there's one last question over there.
It's more of a comment than a question. I've really enjoyed your talk. I've always believed that the Maryland campaign is, in a sense, the high watermark of the Civil War, more so than Gettysburg, because of the Emancipation Proclamation. To me, that changed the whole nature of the war and made it a zero-sum game. Do you have a...
Okay, I think James McPherson was one of the first authors to say that really Antietam is more important because of the emancipation. My view of the emancipation is that it was brilliant in the sense that when, at least from my, and I'm not a lawyer, at least from my interpretation, is that it's like anything else. People read the headlines but didn't read the content. And it gave Lincoln the authority to recruit black soldiers. It was something, too, that brings up may I speak about that controversy? Of black soldiers? Okay.
I think
One
it's
of the
okay.
things I've heard, well, I'm going to ask before I get thrown out. One of the things I've come across is that Surgeon Lewis Steiner in Frederick, U.S. Sanitary Commission, wrote in his diary that as the Confederates marched through, he saw approximately 3,000 black soldiers, all in uniform, various types, but with the Confederates, you name it, it's a uniform, and many of them armed and in all three branches of service. When his diary got published after the emancipation, the first draft of the emancipation was issued, Congress suppressed his diary. Well, I've been doing some research. I have records of black Confederate infantry, cavalry, and artillery at Lee's Mills, Virginia in April 1862 and at Williamsburg in May of 62. Now, the controversy, of course, well, why would blacks fight for the Confederacy? They wouldn't let slaves fight. Well, they might have been freemen, they might have been slaves, no one knows for sure. One of the things I've heard put out, though, is that the reason Frederick Douglass was so angry with Lincoln over not doing anything about emancipation was because he apparently had heard something about black Confederates. Now, I'm not going to argue if it's right or wrong or what, because I don't have all the numbers on it. I'm not an expert on that. But it shocked Union soldiers to see it because they thought, wait a minute, what are they doing over there? No one ever completely answered why they were there, but they were. And is something that needs further investigation. I will add as a comment that in Arlington, at the Confederate section of it, the Confederate monument, which was designed by Moses Ezekiel, a Jewish Confederate infantryman who expatriated to France, that on the relief on it, the Confederate column marched into battle, and very clearly in the ranks, a black Confederate soldier in uniform carrying a weapon. It's something which we've ignored because generally African Americans until recently have been written out of the history by both sides. So it's still an area for investigation.
A very provocative note on which to
You know,
end our talk. In any event, we thank Mike Priest for his talk, and we would like to, on his behalf, make a donation to the Western Maryland Interpreting Association.
I got the lowdown on that. They changed rules.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, you gotta send it to the National Park Service,
Oh, National Park.
Antietam National Battlefield,
Okay.
and put on the check donation.
Okay.
I called yesterday to find out because they're always changing the rules,
Yeah, I'll get.
and they just changed it.
Yeah, the WMIA runs the bookstore.
Right, they're the
there,
ones that run the
and,
tour.
And they also, Mary recalls us, they gave us a very nice deal on the John Hoptack book, which was part of our tourkit. So they do a lot of fine work in Western Maryland. So on Mike's behalf, we will make that donation, however,
Yeah,
which
I
way it has to go.
appreciate
So with that, we are about to be dismissed from class, except to let you all know, on the 11th of October, William Cooper, another fine Southern gentleman, who will then be followed by Larry Hewitt in November. We're not going to be able to understand any Northern accents after a few months here. William Cooper will be here to speak on We Have the War Upon Us, the beginning of the war. So we'll look forward to that and look forward to seeing all of you. Thank you very much. I had a very good time.